The wind cut through the bone, like truth, quiet, biting, and uninvited. James Brant sat hunched in the wagon seat, his broad shoulders wrapped in a wool coat that had faded along with much of his life. The trail behind him was a frozen scar across the prairie, traced by the iron rims of his wheels and the ghost of his intentions. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular, not really. Just to town, just to feed, just to survive another day, where the only voices in his cabin were the wind in the rafters and the memory of a laugh he hadn't heard in 3 winters. His horse, a tired bay gelding with ribs like bent slats under skin, wheezed in the cold as they clattered down the main street of Sundown Ridge. The buildings were shuttered tight, glass winking with frost, smoke curling thin and tired from chimneys. The town wasn't dead, but it had the look of something trying not to breathe too loud. James liked that. The quiet. The way people didn't ask questions anymore. He pulled up near the mercantile, boots hitting hard-packed snow with a crack. He patted the horse's neck, then stepped to the back of the wagon to check the sacks he'd bartered last week. Beans, coffee, and salt. Just enough to get by. He reached for the tarp. It moved. He froze. Not the wind. Not an animal. A shift, human. He heard it then, a shallow breath, the tremble of cotton skirts brushing wood, the rustle of someone trying not to be found. James didn't speak, just stared, one hand still on the tarp, the other drifting to the knife at his belt. Not fast, not threatening. Careful. He eased the canvas back. She was curled beneath an old quilt he didn't recognize. Knees to her chest, boots nearly worn through, a bonnet half crushed beneath her head. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, lips pale but chapped from travel. She couldn't have been much over 20, but it was hard to tell. Grime and exhaustion blurred the edges of youth. Her eyes snapped open, hazel, startled, familiar with fear. She scrambled halfway up, tangled in the quilt, voice rough and dry. Frank. James didn't answer. He didn't know who Frank was. He didn't know what this woman was doing asleep in his wagon. But he saw the way her fingers clenched around a folded piece of paper, creased, damp, clutched like scripture. "You're not," she began, then stopped. Looked around. Realized what she'd done. I thought this was. He held up a hand. "Don't matter." His voice was low, worn smooth. "You hungry?" She blinked, swallowed, nodded. He passed her a strip of jerky from his coat pocket, still wrapped in wax paper. She took it like a person not used to being offered things. Bit slow, chewed slower. Eyes never left him. "I don't want trouble," she said after a moment. Her voice was soft, careful, threaded with something she hadn't learned to trust. "I just needed somewhere warm. I was walking. Then I couldn't." James nodded once. "You walked far." She looked down. Far enough. The jerky was gone. Her hand still hovered near her mouth, like she didn't want to let go of it. "You runnin'?" he asked. Not sharply. Just the way you'd ask the time. She didn't answer. Not with words. Just looked at the paper in her hand, then tucked it into her bodice like something sacred. James studied her. Not with judgment. Just the way he looked at weather. What was coming. What it might take with it. He reached behind the bench and pulled out a heavier quilt. One his wife had sewn in the first year of their marriage, back when colors meant something. He handed it down. She took it in silence. "You can ride back with me," he said, almost as an afterthought. "If you want." The woman hesitated, then nodded. James climbed back into the seat, cracked the reins, and turned the wagon toward the edge of town. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from, or who Frank was, or what she meant by couldn't. He didn't need to. She was running from something, maybe someone. So was he, in his own way. The sun dropped lower, shadows stretching long across the land. The snow had softened but not melted, and the trees stood bare as bones. When they reached the cabin, set back from the trail, half sunk into a hillside like it didn't want to be seen, he stepped down and led the horse to the lean-to. She followed, the quilt around her shoulders like a worn shawl. Didn't ask what place this was, or who it belonged to. Maybe she knew it didn't matter. Inside, the cabin held the smell of dry wood, coffee grounds, and dust. A kettle sat on the iron stove. A single chair by the hearth. 2 boots near the door, 1 pair too small for any man, untouched in months. James lit the lamp. She stood in the doorway, hesitant. "You can take the cot," he said, gesturing to the far wall. "I'll stay near the stove." She nodded, then walked slow toward the cot. Her knees buckled a little when she reached it, but she caught herself. "I'm Olivia," she murmured, without turning. He paused, then said, "James." That was all. He poured water from the kettle into a tin cup and set it on the small table between them. She looked at it like it was too much. Outside, the wind started up again, low and steady. The dog, old, brindled, and nearly deaf, wandered in from the shed and laid down by the stove, not even pausing to sniff the stranger. James sat in the chair, the fire crackling behind him. He took out a small tin from his coat pocket. Inside, a lock of hair, a button, and a folded drawing done in crayon. He didn't open it, just held the tin like a weight he'd grown used to carrying. Olivia turned on the cot, facing the wall. She didn't ask who the drawing belonged to. She didn't need to. In the stillness, time passed like water under ice, slow, inevitable, unnoticed until it cracked. Later that night, when James lay down on the floor, he noticed something. Her boots had been placed side by side, neatly, by the cot. She hadn't just dropped them. She'd been taught to be careful, maybe punished if she wasn't. He closed his eyes. He didn't know why he hadn't sent her away. Maybe it was the way she looked at the cup before taking it. Maybe it was how she never once asked for anything. Maybe it was just the season, and the way winter made everything feel like it might not survive another night. He heard her breathing, soft now, even. And something else. A humming, barely there. A lullaby maybe, off-key, but full of some memory she hadn't yet buried. James didn't move. The fire dimmed. In the dark, 2 strangers lay under different roofs of sorrow. One fresh, one worn smooth, but for the first time in a long while, neither of them was alone. And outside, the snow began again. Morning came slow, with a sky the color of ash and air sharp enough to sting the lungs. The world outside the cabin lay hushed in snow, but inside something shifted, not loudly, not even visibly, just enough to be felt. Olivia rose before James did. She moved like someone afraid to wake a sleeping house, each step measured, every drawer opened with care. The kettle hissed before the fire caught fully. She kept her back to him while he stirred beneath his blanket, watching from the corner of one eye as she folded her quilt, smoothed her skirts, and began slicing what remained of a winter apple. James didn't speak until she passed him a tin cup of water. "You slept," he said. She nodded. "Better than I expected." He didn't say it, but he had to. They ate quietly, bread hard from the cold, apple thinly sliced between them. The silence wasn't uneasy. It was the kind that forms between people who've learned not to fill space with noise. She moved around the cabin like she'd lived there once before, in another life maybe. She swept ashes into the pail, folded the cot blanket again after rising, checked the window seams for drafts. James watched her, not with suspicion, but with a slow study of someone remembering what it meant to share time. Later, he offered her a pair of boots from the back of the cupboard, his late wife's, worn at the heel but lined with fleece. Olivia took them with quiet hands, brushing her thumb once over the stitching. "They fit," she said, "though they look too snug." James nodded. Didn't expect they'd get worn again. She didn't ask whose they'd been. She didn't need to. Days passed like that, not marked by any clock, but by repetition, chores, meals, light shifting across the floorboards. James would head out at dawn to feed the horse and check the fence line. Olivia would stay behind, minding the fire, kneading dough she managed to coax from flour and lard, patching a torn seam in one of his shirts with thread she found tucked in a drawer beside old receipts and brittle paper valentines. She never asked to stay, and he never asked her to leave. They didn't speak much, but in the small gestures, him brushing snow from the porch before she stepped out, her setting his cup where she knew he liked it, something unspoken gathered between them, like warmth in the walls. She began to hum when she worked. Nothing loud, just small, wandering tunes, half remembered. It made the space feel fuller. One morning, he returned from the barn to find her seated by the stove, needle in hand, mending a leather glove that hadn't fit right since his second winter alone. Her hair was down, plait half undone, wisps curling near her cheek from the steam of the kettle. "You don't need to fix everything," he said gently. She smiled without looking up. "Maybe not, but it helps." That day, the dog returned to her side. He'd taken to lying near her feet, and when she bent to rub behind his ear, James saw something settle in the animal's posture. A trust earned, not given. In the barn, tucked high in the rafters, Olivia found a child's toy horse. Wooden, carved by hand. The tail was missing, and one wheel had split, but she didn't ask whose it had been. She set it on the mantel like it belonged there, like it always had. James noticed it the next evening. He didn't touch it, didn't speak of it, just stared for a long moment before sitting down and lighting his pipe. That night, a storm rolled in. Not thunder, just snow, soft but insistent, blanketing everything in slow erasure. They watched from the window. James with his arms crossed, Olivia wrapped in the old quilt again. Her fingers gripped the edges tighter than the cold required. He spoke then. First time in a long while. "I buried them out back. Wife and daughter. Pneumonia took 'em. Winter like this one." Olivia said nothing, just stood still beside him. He turned slightly. "You." She exhaled, a breath she'd been holding for years. "I was promised to a man who liked the sound of his own boots more than the sound of my voice. Told me I'd be safe. Gave me a letter to prove it. Then changed." James didn't ask how. He didn't need to. He saw it in the way she flinched when doors slammed, in the way she avoided looking at herself too long in the mirror. "You left him?" She nodded once. "When I figured I could either die slow there or risk dying fast on the road." They stood in the silence that followed. Not empty silence, waited. A recognition. The next day, Olivia ventured out with him to the creek, her shawl tied tight under her chin. The path was slippery, but she didn't ask for help. He didn't offer, just walked beside her, the way some men walk behind coffins, reverent, steady, full of silent respect. She spoke as they reached the edge. "You always live like this?" James looked out at the frost-bitten brush, at the trees standing bare like they were waiting for something to come back. "Not always. Used to think I was a husband, a father. Then I just became a man with a name." Olivia's breath clouded before her. "You still are." He looked at her, really looked, not with pity, with something like memory. They returned in silence, and something about the walk seemed to stitch their silences closer together, like fabric finally meeting its seam. That evening, she brought out a half-finished quilt she found folded beneath a cedar chest. The pattern was off, one square unmatched, the thread different from the rest. She ran her fingers over it gently. "Yours?" she asked. He shook his head. "Hers." She never got to finish. Olivia set it on her lap. "Maybe I could." He didn't respond, but when he reached for his pipe, his hands trembled slightly. The dog shifted closer to the fire. The cabin breathed with them. Later, as the wind rose outside and the fire burned low, Olivia placed a small tin box on the table. James recognized it. One of his. Forgotten. Inside, she had tucked the wooden horse, the first patch of the finished quilt, and the drawing she'd found tucked in the locket he never opened. "You're not the only one carrying things," she said, voice like soft rain. "Sometimes it helps to set them down. Just for a while." James stared at the box, then at her, then nodded. Outside, the storm didn't let up, but inside, something different settled. She moved toward the cot, he toward the chair. Before she lay down, she turned. "James." He looked up. "I'm not trying to stay. Not unless there's room for more than just surviving." He held her gaze, then rose, walked to the hearth, picked up the quilt square she'd sewn. "There might be," he said, voice thick, "if you want." She nodded once, then turned away. In the dark, the wind howled, but neither of them heard it as loud anymore. The cabin, worn and tired as it was, felt less like a grave and more like a shelter. And for the first time in a long while, the night passed without either of them wishing it away. The snow had crusted over by morning, hard and brittle beneath James's boots. He hitched the wagon with practiced ease, though his shoulder ached from the weight of a life done mostly alone. Olivia watched from the porch, arms crossed, her shawl wrapped tight against a wind that no longer seemed to surprise her. She didn't ask where he was headed, just met his eyes for a long moment, then nodded. He didn't say when he'd be back. He never did. But she always kept the coffee warm until the door opened again. Sundown Ridge looked different in daylight. The snow flattened its flaws, hiding broken window panes and weather-rotted signs beneath a sheet of white. The mercantile's bell rang sharp as James entered, boots thudding on the warped wood. He nodded to the clerk, dropped a list on the counter, and moved toward the back, where feed was kept in thick burlap sacks and molasses was stored in jars the color of blood amber. He was reaching for one when the voice stopped him, smooth, polished, with just enough rust under the shine to make a man listen closely. "Pardon me," the stranger said. "I'm looking for someone." James didn't turn immediately, just kept his hand on the jar, breathing slow. The man was well-dressed, but not too well. He wore trailed dust like a costume, a long coat, fur-lined gloves, a hat that hadn't seen honest weather. His boots were new, clean, too clean. That alone made James distrust him. "I was told there's a woman, young, travels alone, might have come through here," the man continued, answering to the name Olivia May. James didn't flinch, not outwardly, but something in his chest shifted, slow and heavy. He straightened, jar in hand, and turned. "Name's Frank Talbot," the man offered, extending a gloved hand. James didn't take it. "Don't know her." Talbot smiled. "Pity. She's my fiancé. Ran off before the wedding. Left me with a preacher and a lot of questions." There was something behind the man's eyes, something too still, like a snake in a hollow log. James knew the type. All charm until something slipped. "She's a small thing," Talbot went on, as if painting a picture. "Dark hair. Wears that uncertainty like perfume. Makes a man want to save her, you know." James said nothing. "She's got a letter on her," Talbot added. "Signed by me. Legal arrangement. Not quite marriage, but close enough by God's standards. Surely you'd remember a girl like that." I said I didn't. A pause stretched between them. Talbot smiled again, softer now, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, tucking his gloves back into his coat, "if you happen to see her, let her know I've been patient. And I'd appreciate it if she came back on her own." James didn't speak as Talbot walked out, the bell above the door ringing behind him. He finished loading the wagon in silence. His hands moved as they always did, methodical, steady, but his mind had already ridden home ahead of him. Olivia met him at the door when he returned, snow up to her ankles, hair tucked behind her ears. Her expression shifted the moment she saw his face. Not fear, but knowing. "He's here," she said quietly. James gave a slow nod. They didn't speak of it that night. She stirred stew with a ladle handle worn smooth by years of hands that weren't hers. He chopped firewood until his muscles throbbed. They moved around each other like people in the same storm, both waiting for the thunder. It came the next morning. Olivia was hanging wet linens by the stove, steam rising from the fabric like breath, when the knock sounded. Not frantic, not urgent, just entitled. James opened the door. Talbot stood there, hat in hand, smiling like a man greeting old friends. His coat gleamed, and his horse behind him was sleek and black, steam curling from its nostrils. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said, already stepping forward. James blocked the entrance with his body. "You are." Talbot looked past him. "Olivia." Her name hung in the air like something fragile. She stepped into view, still holding the wet cloth. Her face was unreadable. "There you are," Talbot said, like finding a misplaced glove. "I've come to take you home." Olivia didn't move. "You left in a hurry," he continued. "Didn't even pack your things. I figured you'd cooled off and just needed a little time." Still, she said nothing. James didn't step aside. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't choose." Talbot turned his attention back to him, the smile dimming. "I don't believe I introduced myself properly. Frank Talbot, banker, landowner, and most importantly, her betrothed." No law says a woman has to return to a man just 'cause he says she should. There's a contract, Talbot said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a folded paper. Signed, witnessed, paid for. She's not property. She's mine, Talbot snapped, then caught himself. Smoothed his tone. By law and arrangement. And you're harboring her. Could get yourself into trouble for that. James looked at Olivia. Her hands were trembling slightly, still gripping the cloth. Do you want to go with him? He asked, voice low. Olivia didn't answer right away. She stared at Talbot, then at the floor, then finally up into James's face. No, she said, just above a whisper. Talbot's jaw tightened. I'm afraid that's not up to you, sweetheart, he said, stepping forward. We had an agreement. And you've cost me reputation, money, time. You're coming back. James's hand went to the hammer loop on his belt. He didn't draw. Didn't need to. She said no. Talbot's mouth twisted. You think this place changes anything? You think playing house with some broken-down farmer makes you clean? Olivia flinched, but didn't back away. She stepped closer to James, not behind him. I'm not yours, she said, voice steadier now. I never was. Talbot looked between them, something turning in his eyes. Contempt, confusion, disbelief. You'll regret this, he said finally. Both of you. He turned, walked out. The door closed behind him like a lid on something rotting. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Olivia dropped the cloth. James exhaled. You all right? He asked. She nodded. I think so. The fire crackled behind them. Later, she sat by the window, watching Talbot's silhouette disappear into the trees. Her face was pale, but her spine didn't curl like it used to. She held a cup of coffee in both hands, steam rising between her lips as she breathed it in like something holy. James didn't press her, just sat across from her in his usual chair, carving a new handle for the kettle hook. His hands moved slowly, shaving curls from the wood, the rhythm steady and grounding. The dog lay between them. Outside, snow fell again. That night, neither of them slept much. But neither of them were alone either. In the early hours, Olivia stood barefoot by the hearth. She held the paper Talbot had left, reading it one last time before feeding it to the flames. The ink curled and vanished into black. James watched her from a chair. She didn't know he was awake. When she turned, she caught his eye. Do you believe in beginnings? She asked softly. He thought about it for a long moment. I believe in choosing, he said. And sometimes that looks like starting over. She nodded. Then she crossed the room, took his hand, and sat with him until the fire burned down low. There were no promises spoken, no grand alleviations, just warmth, just presence, just the slow, quiet truth of two people no longer trying to escape their pasts, but letting the other stand beside them in it. And somewhere out in the dark, the echo of Talbot's boots faded completely. The storm rolled in overnight. By morning, the world beyond the cabin had vanished beneath a curtain of white. Snowflakes clung to the window panes in thick clusters, muting the light and softening the edges of everything. Inside, the fire burned low, casting shadows that danced across Olivia's face as she sat wrapped in the patchwork quilt, mending a torn seam in one of James's shirts. Her fingers moved steadily, but her thoughts were elsewhere. James stood by the door, staring out into the shapeless drift. He'd known the storm was coming. The signs had been there, the way the wind shifted, the brittle hush of the air. But this storm wasn't just snow and sky. It was something heavier, something waiting. He could feel it pressing against the door, in the pit of his stomach, in the silence between each word he and Olivia hadn't said since Talbot had come and gone. But they both knew he'd return. When the knock came just before dusk, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was certain. Entitled. The same as before. James didn't look at Olivia. He didn't need to. He opened the door. Talbot stood there, as if summoned by the wind, his coat dusted in snow, his gloves removed and tucked beneath one arm, like he meant to stay a while. Behind him, his horse stood tethered, flanks quivering from a cold, steam rising in harsh clouds from its nostrils. Evening, Talbot said, stepping inside uninvited. James didn't stop him this time. He moved aside, not as permission, but as measure. He was not afraid. But he was listening. Olivia stood from her chair. The shirt she'd been mending slipped to the floor, forgotten. Her hands clenched at her sides, but she didn't retreat. Talbot removed his hat slowly, eyes scanning the cabin as if taking inventory of what had changed. His gaze lingered on the cot in the corner, on the folded blanket at its edge, on the place where Olivia had made a space for herself. Something flickered in his expression, possessiveness, maybe, or disappointment. "This is cozy," he said. "Rustic. You always did like simple things." Olivia didn't respond. He stepped closer, still wearing that half-smile, the one that had once charmed boarding-house keepers and shop clerks alike. "I came to talk," he said, civilly. James remained near the stove, quiet, watchful. A pot of stew bubbled low behind him. He didn't offer a bowl. "I understand," Talbot said, turning back to Olivia, "that you've been confused. I take some blame for that. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I should have been gentler." His voice had the polish of a man used to speaking for others. Olivia didn't interrupt. "I've given it thought," he continued, "and I'm willing to start over. Forget this detour. Bring you home. You'll have your place again. Your dresses. Your piano. You won't have to stitch old shirts for some widower out in the hills." She flinched then, not from his words, but from the assumption behind them. James moved slightly, his fingers resting on the edge of the stove, calm but poised. Olivia took a breath. It came out slow, trembling. But when she spoke, her voice was clear. "I don't want your piano." Talbot blinked. "What?" "I don't want your dresses. Or your house. Or the way you talk to me, like I'm something you bought." The air between them thinned. "You're tired," Talbot said. "You've been in this place too long. You forgot what comfort feels like." Olivia shook her head. "I didn't forget. I just stopped believing it had to come with bruises." Talbot's face changed then. Something broke through the charm. Not rage, not yet. Just confusion. The slow realization that the control he thought he'd held had slipped. "I never hit you," he said sharply. "Not really. You're exaggerating. You don't have to use fists to hurt someone." Silence fell. Talbot looked toward James then, as if for backup, but found only steady eyes. "You going to let her say these things?" Talbot asked. "When there's a contract in place, a promise made." James didn't answer immediately. He straightened from the stove, poured coffee into a tin cup, and handed it to Olivia. "She can say whatever's true," he said, "and she can decide where she goes." "She's mine," Talbot snapped louder now. "You think this backwoods hospitality gives you claim over her? I've got papers." "I don't care what you've got," James said evenly. "You want to take her, ask her. Not me." "She doesn't know what she wants," Talbot muttered. "She never did." Olivia stepped forward. The coffee in her hand didn't spill. "I do now," she said. "I didn't before, when I thought I had to be grateful for a man noticing me. When I thought surviving meant saying yes. But I know now." Talbot stared at her like she was a stranger. She stood straighter than he remembered, spoke with a steadiness he didn't recognize. Whatever had lived in her eyes before, fear, uncertainty, had been replaced with something still and rooted. "I came to get you," he said quietly, "to make things right. You came to reclaim something that doesn't belong to you." The words landed like stones. James stepped between them then, not in defense, not in rescue, but in support. Silent, grounded. Talbot's hand twitched toward his coat. James noticed. So did Olivia. "Don't," James said, voice flat. Talbot hesitated. His face twisted with something like embarrassment, or maybe resentment. "I could bring the sheriff out here," he said. "Make trouble for both of you." "You could try," James replied. "But you won't." Talbot looked between them, and for the first time he seemed to understand that something irreversible had happened. That the woman who'd once answered his beck and call now stood beside another man, not as possession, but as person. "You'll regret this," he said again, but it sounded emptier now. Olivia turned away, not in retreat, but in dismissal. "I already did," she said softly, "but not anymore." James opened the door. Talbot stared a moment longer, then stepped out. Snow lashed across his face as he mounted his horse. He didn't look back. James shut the door against the cold. Olivia sat down at the table, setting the coffee gently beside her. Her hand shook then, not from fear, but from release. He sat across from her. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she looked at him. "Thank you." He nodded. "Wasn't mine to give. Just stood with you." She looked down at her hands, then at the shirt she dropped. "You don't owe me anything," James said, reading the question she hadn't asked. "You can go. You're free." She studied the fabric in her hands, ran her thumb along the seam she'd mended. "I don't want to go," she said. And just like that, something shifted. Not loud, not sudden, just the quiet turning of a page. James stood, took her empty cup, and refilled it. When he set it down again, he didn't speak, just sat back in his chair like he had every night for months, and waited for the fire to settle. The wind still howled outside, but it no longer sounded like a threat. And when Olivia picked up the shirt again and threaded her needle, her hands were steady. The wind screamed through the cottonwoods that lined the ridge, their skeletal limbs shuddering beneath the weight of ice and sky. All night it had howled like an old pain, dragging snow in great sweeping arcs across the hills, trying to erase what lay below. But by morning, the world stood still again. The storm had broken. James stepped onto the porch with a rifle slung over one shoulder and steam curling from the tin mug in his hand. The cold was deep, but he barely noticed. His eyes swept across the prairie, where snow blanketed the land like a secret too heavy to speak aloud. The path to the barn had disappeared. The fences were buried to their posts. But the sky at last was clear. Behind him, the door creaked open. Olivia stepped out, arms wrapped tight around her shawl, eyes squinting against the morning glare. Her cheeks were red from the warmth of the fire, her hair braided back the way she always wore it when she wanted her hands free. She said nothing at first, just stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. A quiet companion in a world slowly coming awake again. "I thought storms like that only came in books," she murmured. James took a sip from his mug. "They come here, too. Just less poetry about it." She smiled faintly and looked out over the land. Her breath fogged in the air, trailing off in small puffs before disappearing into nothing. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, not needing to explain who she meant. James shook his head. "Not this time." "How do you know?" "Because you chose," he said simply. "That's the one thing men like him can't undo." Olivia looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were dry, skin cracked at the edges. But they were steady, strong. She hadn't trembled since the night she'd told Talbot no. She glanced at him. "Would you have shot him?" He met her gaze. "If I had to." She nodded slowly. "I believe that." James didn't answer. He didn't need to. They stood together in silence until the cold began to press into their bones. Later in the barn, Olivia worked beside him, helping to clear snow from the doors. The boards creaked under their weight, but held. The horses nickered from inside, restless but alive. Together, they hauled feed, checked hooves, worked in a rhythm that had become second nature. When they paused, she leaned against the beam, brushing sweat from her brow with her sleeve. Her breath came hard, her cheeks flushed from effort. He passed her the water canteen without a word, and she drank deeply, eyes closed. "Do you miss her?" she asked quietly, eyes still shut. James took a long breath before answering. "Every day," he said, "but it doesn't ache the same." Olivia opened her eyes. "Did you love her the way a man's supposed to love?" He didn't answer right away. The question wasn't a trap, it was a measure. "I loved her in the way I knew how," he said finally. "And I buried her with every piece of me that couldn't go on." Olivia looked away, her thumb brushing the worn edge of the canteen. "I wonder if anyone will ever say that about me," she said softly. "That I was loved rightly." James stepped closer. "I don't think love is about saying it. It's about the quiet things. Staying when you could leave. Listening when it's easier not to. Laying your grief beside someone else's and not asking them to move it." She swallowed hard, but didn't look at him. "I used to believe love looked like permission," she whispered. "Now I think it looks like a door that isn't locked." James nodded. I don't know what I can give you, she said after a long pause. I've got a past, a bruised name, and hands that can't seem to stay still. I don't need more than that, he said. And if you decide to leave tomorrow, I'll still be glad you were here today. The words hit her deeper than she expected. She turned her face away, but he saw the shimmer at the corner of her eye. By midday, the wind had calmed. The sky hung low and pale, but without menace. They worked together without speaking much, clearing the walk, stacking firewood, checking traps along the tree line. The land had a rhythm, and in it, their silence found music. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Olivia stood at the window, watching the last of the sun catch on the snowdrifts. The golden light washed over her features, softening the worry lines etched by too many miles, too many near mistakes. James watched her from a table, not trying to be discreet. She caught him looking and didn't look away. "What do you see?" she asked. "Someone who stayed." The quiet that followed was different than all the others. Not strained, not uncertain, just full. She walked to the hearth and retrieved a small tin box she'd placed on the mantel weeks ago. Inside, she kept the pieces that mattered: James's daughter's drawing, the wooden horse, the patchwork square, and now, the locket she'd worn the night he found her. She opened it for the first time in his presence and showed him what lay inside. A pressed flower, long dried. A piece of blue ribbon. A name scrawled on the inside lid: Olivia May Talbot. She stared at it, then looked at James. "I think it's time I changed that." He said nothing, just nodded slowly. That night, as the wind curled against the windows and the fire crackled low, she reached for his hand. "I was waiting for someone to save me," she said. "But I didn't need saving. I just needed space to remember who I was." James didn't answer, just held her hand tighter. In the morning, they rode into town. Sundown Ridge was quieter than usual, still blanketed in white. A few shopkeepers shoveled walkways. A boy chased a chicken down the lane. No one paid them much attention. They dismounted in front of the post office, where Olivia pulled a letter from her satchel. Inside, the clerk looked up, startled by the sight of him. She stepped forward, slid the letter across the counter. "I'd like to cancel an arrangement," she said, calm but clear. "Olivia May Talbot is no longer in need of correspondence." The clerk blinked. "Is that legal?" Olivia smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter." Back outside, James helped her onto the wagon. They sat side by side, reins loose in his hands. As they turned the bend out of town, Olivia leaned into him, just slightly. "You never asked me what I wanted," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She looked out at the hills. "I want to stay. Not as a guest. Not as something rescued. Just me." James nodded. "Then we'll make room." The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ruts, the sound folding into the hush of a land. When they reached the cabin, she didn't wait for him to help her down. She walked straight to the front door, opened it, and stepped inside like she belonged. That night, she pulled the cot apart, folded the blanket, carried the pillow to the bedroom she hadn't yet entered. James stood in the doorway, watching her. "You sure?" he asked. She turned. "I'm choosing this." He nodded. "Then I am too." She stepped into him, arms sliding around his waist. He held her like a man holding something he never expected to find again. No promises, no vows, just presence. And when morning came, with sunlight flooding the cabin and the snow outside beginning to melt in earnest, Olivia stood in the kitchen, stirring coffee, humming a low, wordless tune. James came in behind her, wrapped his arms around her middle, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "You always hum when you're at peace," he murmured. She smiled. "Or when I remember I'm allowed to be." And somewhere outside, the last breath of winter sighed through the trees, less like an ending, more like a benediction.
The fog rolled in like breath from the belly of the earth, soft and silver, clinging to the grass and fence rails as if afraid to let go. The land lay hushed beneath it, soaked in spring's slow promise, wet soil, swollen creek beds, and the sharp green of new things pushing up through winter's grief. On a rise above the pasture stood a man, still as a fence post, hat brim low, eyes tracing the faint figure cutting across his land. Colt Mallory didn't like surprises. He liked dawns that came slow, horses that minded their training, and days that passed without a fuss. But this morning, through the slow-pouring mist, something unfamiliar moved, a woman walking with the rhythm of someone who didn't beg the land for mercy, but endured it with grace. She led a Mustang, raw-boned and beautiful, its eyes wild, hooves hesitant on soft ground. Colt's brow furrowed beneath his hat. Strangers rarely came this way. Fewer still walked in on foot, dragging a storm-eyed stallion behind them. She came to the fence line and paused, letting the horse nuzzle the dew-laced wire. Her dress was worn but not ragged, a hem frayed by distance. She wore no bonnet, only a braid, thick and dark, coiled like a rope over one shoulder. Colt said nothing. Neither did she. "I ain't lookin' for charity," she said at last, her voice low and sure, carrying across the fence like a prayer spoken to no one. "Just need a place to work with him. A few days. I'll stay out of your way." Colt shifted his weight, the wood of the porch groaning under his boots. The dog at his feet, old and lame in the hind legs, gave a quiet whine. "You planning to pay in rainwater and good intentions?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Got some coin. Not much. But I've got more sense than to camp near town. Out here's better. Quieter." Colt studied the horse, who tossed his head and blew hard through flared nostrils. A Mustang, newly caught. Not broken, barely touched. The woman, on the other hand, looked like someone who'd been broken and built herself back with no help at all. He gestured toward the barn with the smallest nod. "Loft's dry. Creek's still runnin'. Don't let him near the west pasture. My mare won't have it." She inclined her head, just a breath of thanks, and led the horse on. Colt watched until the fog swallowed her again. That night, he lit a fire in the stove, fed the dog scraps from a tin, and sat by the window longer than usual. He didn't know her name. Didn't know what kind of woman brought a wild thing into the middle of nowhere and asked for nothing but space. But he remembered the way she stood, like someone who'd already been turned away too many times to beg again. Morning broke slow and gold. The fog lifted, and with it, the quiet returned to its usual rhythm. Chickens scratching, the creak of the windmill, the low call of doves nesting in the eaves. Colt saddled his mare and rode the fence line, eyes drawn now and again toward the far paddock where she worked. She had the Mustang in a rough round pen made from borrowed logs and stubborn ingenuity. No whip, no shouting. Just a rope, patience, and a soft humming he couldn't make out. The horse circled her like a shadow with too much memory. Day after day, he watched her shape silence into trust. By the third morning, he left a coil of better rope near the barn door. She didn't thank him, but she used it. That afternoon, she brought in a pail of creek water and washed his porch without being asked. She said nothing when he came outside, only kept scrubbing as if his space had become hers to tend. The Mustang softened. So did something in him. Her name, he learned on the 5th day, was Lily. She said it when the old dog wandered to her camp, and she coaxed him back with jerky from her pack. "Lily Vale," she told the dog, not the man, as she scratched behind his ears. "You're a good boy. Don't let that sour old man tell you different." Colt, from the porch, sipped his coffee and made no comment. He didn't ask where she was from. He didn't ask where she meant to go. But he began to notice things. A stitched tear in her sleeve, the way she checked the sky before every chore, as if expecting trouble to come in the shape of weather or men. She mended one of his fence posts after a windstorm. He brought her half a loaf of bread and didn't say why. They never spoke longer than a few words, but the words mattered. No fluff, no lies. Just truths made small and sharp. One evening, clouds bruised the sky. Rain came in soft sheets, dappling the dust, pooling under the eaves. Colt sat on the porch, coat pulled tight. She came up the steps quiet as dusk and stood beside him, hands calloused, skirt hem wet. "The horse took a saddle today," she said, voice low, almost reverent. "Didn't think he'd come round so soon." "He didn't come round. He just stopped fighting me." Colt thought about that a moment. Sometimes that's worse. They didn't speak after that. Just sat listening to the rain. She didn't ask to come inside. He didn't offer. But something passed between them all the same, like a door cracking open just enough to let the light through. Spring deepened. The days lengthened, and the Mustang no longer shied from her touch. He'd still bolt at loud noises, still test the rope, but there was a quiet between them now. Mutual understanding. Colt saw it and recognized it. The horse wasn't tamed. He was met halfway, like he was with her. Colt wasn't young. His hands were worn, knuckles scarred. He'd buried a wife in hard earth 5 years ago and hadn't let anyone close since. But watching Lily in the early morning haze, whispering to a creature everyone else would have broken with brute force, something inside him softened. She never spoke about herself unless pressed. He never pressed. But when she handed him a piece of tack one morning, asking for a second opinion, and their fingers brushed, brief, barely there, it felt like a promise neither of them had made out loud yet. That night, Colt dreamt of a woman standing in a field of wildflowers, hair caught in the wind, a Mustang circling her like a sentinel. When he woke, the fire had gone out, but the warmth remained. He didn't know what she was running from. Maybe she wasn't running at all. Maybe she was just tired of being told where she belonged. But he did know this. She wasn't just gentling that horse. She was trying to reclaim something of herself. And whether she meant to or not, she was starting to do the same to him. A week in, and the Mustang followed her without a rope. She rode him bareback in the field just beyond the barn, hair loose, face calm. Colt watched from a distance, one hand resting on the porch rail like it might steady him. The dog barked once. A hawk wheeled overhead. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of lilacs and damp wood. And for the first time in years, Colt Mallory felt something he hadn't dared name. Hope. Not loud. Not sudden. Just quiet enough to notice. And just strong enough to stay. The mornings came earlier now, stretched thinner by spring's lengthening light. The frost had lifted from the fields, though Colt still found it clinging to his bones when he rose. He moved slower than he used to, rheumatism in the knees, time in the shoulders, but habit kept him steady. Feed the stock. Check the fence line. Mend what's fraying before it tears. Each morning, Lily was already at work. She moved with a quiet rhythm, her days shaped by patience and instinct. The Mustang, she called him Flint now, was no longer wild-eyed, though he kept a wary distance from all but her. He shadowed her like a second spine, alert to her breath, her hands, her unspoken commands. Colt watched from the edges, from the porch or the barn, never interfering. It wasn't just the horse she was gentling. It was the silence, the space between people, the ache that builds up in a place too long left alone. He didn't know when it happened, but her presence became part of the ranch's soundscape. Not loud, never that. Just a steady undercurrent. The soft clink of her stirrups as she led Flint. The faint scrape of a knife as she peeled apples by the water trough. Sometimes, he caught her humming, low and dusky, like wind through cottonwood leaves. And when she wasn't there, when she rode out for a few hours into the hills with Flint beneath her, the quiet felt heavier than it used to. She rarely spoke first. But when she did, her words had weight. One morning, as Colt was splitting wood by the shed, she came over with a coil of rope in her hands. The sleeves of her blouse were rolled to the elbow, and the smell of saddle oil clung to her. "You've got a better hand for knots than I do," she said, holding the rope out. "Mind showing me how you tie that half-hitch loop? The one that holds but don't choke." He nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. Took the rope. Showed her slow, explaining with more movement than words. She stood close, watching his fingers, her brows drawn in quiet focus. When she repeated it, the loop fell smooth and obedient beneath her touch. "That one?" she asked. "That's the one," he said. She smiled, faint but real. Good not for a creature that likes to test the line. Good not for a woman that don't give up. He regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth. Not because they were untrue, but because they felt too open, like he'd cracked something that ought to stay shut. But she didn't flinch. "I used to," she said. "Once." Then she walked away. That night, Colt sat on the porch with a tin cup of bitter coffee and tried to remember when he last asked a woman a real question. Not the kind about work or weather. The kind that listens for a soul in the answer. But he said nothing the next day. Or the next. Instead, He fixed the hinge on the barn door she used, left an old brush cleaned and waiting near the hitching post. When her lantern cracked, he replaced the glass without comment. He never told her she was welcome. She never asked if she still could stay. Still, she did. A week passed. Then 2. One evening, after a long day and a short meal, Lily lingered near the porch steps, twisting the hem of her sleeve between calloused fingers. "I never asked," she said. "Why you let me stay?" Colt didn't look at her right away. He watched the horizon instead, soft with the purple of almost night, clouds moving like breath. "You weren't asking for much," he said finally. "And I had more than I needed." She nodded, looking down. "My husband used to say that," she murmured, "right before reminding me I was a burden." Colt turned then, met her eyes. "You ain't a burden, Lily." "I know," she said, but the words sounded rehearsed, like something she told herself in mirrors. He wanted to ask more, to find out what had shaped the woman before she came walking into his fog, Mustang in tow, pride stitched into every seam. But he also knew the weight of stories not ready to be told. So he only said, "You're easy to have around." That, too, was the truth. Spring pressed on. Rain came in bursts, feeding the creeks, coaxing wildflowers from the earth. Lily began riding Flint further afield, sometimes disappearing for half a day, always returning with sun on her skin and a clearer look in her eye. Colt pretended not to notice how the place felt different when she was gone. One afternoon, he found her up by the north field, kneeling beside the old fence post he'd meant to fix for a month. She had a hammer in hand and fresh nails lined along the ground. Her hair was pinned back with a stick of cedar, and her sleeves were dusted with pollen. He rode up slow, dismounted. "Didn't know I hired help." "You didn't," she said, not looking up. "But this land gave me a place when I needed it. Figure I owe it something." Colt leaned against the saddle horn, watching her hands. "That post's rotted through," he said. "Won't hold long." "Still worth trying," she replied. "Until it breaks." He didn't speak, just went and fetched a better post from the shed. They worked side by side until the sun dropped behind the hills. Not many words, just the sound of labor, of effort shared, of people who had stopped expecting anything and yet had somehow begun to build something anyway. Later that night, as he sat by the fire mending an old cinched strap, she came in through the open door, just stepped across the threshold without knocking. He looked up, startled but not displeased. "I brought something," she said, holding out a tin of blackberries. "Where'd you find berries this early?" "Down by the hollow. South-facing slope. Spring runs faster there." He took the tin, nodded his thanks. She turned to leave, then paused. "There was a man," she said, "back east. Said I was too stubborn for gentler things. Said a woman like me needed to be tamed before I'd be worth anything." Colt said nothing. Lily looked at the fire, shadows dancing in her eyes. "I married him anyway. Thought maybe he was right." He stood slowly, the cinched strap falling forgotten to the floor. "He wasn't." She looked up at him, searching. "No, he wasn't." And for a long moment, neither moved. Outside, the wind brushed through the cottonwoods. A coyote called far off, lonesome and sharp. Colt bent, picked up the strap again. The moment passed. But something had shifted. Later, as she walked back to the barn, Colt stood at the door and watched until her lantern flickered to life in the loft window. The dog sighed by his boots. The fire crackled low. There were no declarations, no promises, just two people learning the language of quiet things. And somewhere, deep in the land between them, something began to root. The days came gentler now. Spring had settled into the land's bones, stretching its green fingers across every acre, coaxing life from what had seemed long barren. Colts of all kinds were being born across the country, foals on distant ranches, saplings in broken soil, and maybe something unnamed between two people learning the weight of being seen. Lily Vale rose early, always before the sun, always before Colt. She didn't disturb the quiet, she walked in it like it belonged to her. Flint, no longer wild but never tame, followed her like a shadow softened by trust. She rode him in wide circles beyond the barn, his coat slick with health, her back straight as a rifle, her braid unraveling in the breeze. Colt watched from the kitchen window some mornings, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand, and wondered how many times you could lose something before you stopped expecting anything to grow again. He'd lost his wife to a fevered birth, lost the child with her, and somewhere in the years since, he'd buried more than names in the ground. He'd buried kindness, laughter, maybe even the hope that something soft might come knocking again. But Lily didn't knock. She stayed. And in staying, she carved out space for things with roots. They began to speak more, though never about the future. There was comfort in the present. They talked about the land, fences that needed mending, the first corn shoots poking up by the stream, the neighbor's sheep straying too close again. Small things that, taken together, started to feel like the pieces of a life. One afternoon, Colt found her in the east field, sitting cross-legged beneath the ash tree with Flint grazing nearby. She had a journal open in her lap, though she wasn't writing, just staring at the empty page like it owed her something. He didn't call out, just came to stand near and waited. She looked up eventually, blinking like someone surfacing from deep water. "I used to write," she said. "Thought maybe if I put it all down, I could understand it better." "Does it help?" "Sometimes." She shut the book. "Sometimes it just makes it real." He nodded, not pressing. There were things she hadn't told him. That much he knew. Her hands bore the story of labor, but her eyes carried something harder to name, like she'd survived not just hardship, but disappointment deep enough to feel like betrayal. That night, after supper, she lingered at the porch railing, looking out at the darkened hills. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of wild sage and old wood. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked. He took a breath. "All the time." She looked at him, surprised by the honesty. "It's a different kind of lonely, though," he added. "Not the kind that makes you crave company. Just the kind that makes you ache to be understood." Lily nodded slowly, almost like a prayer. "I know that kind." They didn't say more, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like a room where someone had finally exhaled. In the days that followed, they began sharing more than words. He taught her how to splice a split rein with rawhide. She showed him how she filed Flint's hooves with a practiced hand, gentle but unafraid. They moved together without the awkwardness of newness. There was rhythm in the repetition, the small rituals that made the days hum. One morning, Colt was hauling feed when he heard her laugh, clear, sudden, like water breaking loose from a dam. He turned to see her standing in the paddock, Flint nudging her shoulder insistently with his muzzle. "You're not hungry," she chided, swatting at him playfully. "You're just bored." Colt leaned on the fence, grinning. "He gets that from his company." She narrowed her eyes, mock offended. "You calling me difficult, Mallory?" "Didn't say difficult. Said restless." "Restless isn't always bad," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It means you're still searching." "For what?" She paused, the laughter slipping from her mouth like mist. "For something that feels like home." He said nothing, but his gaze held hers, steady as a nail-driven true. That evening, they shared supper without speaking much. Just the scrape of spoons, the quiet between two people who didn't need to fill space with noise. Afterward, she stayed on the porch while he cleaned up. When he joined her, she was humming again, soft and low. A tune without words. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, settling beside her on the top step. "My mother used to sing it," she said. "She called it a waiting song. For soldiers. Or storms. Or anyone who left and hadn't made it back yet." Colt looked out at the dark, thoughtful. "You think waiting ever gets easier?" "No," she said. "But sometimes, if you're lucky, someone shows up before you have to." The words hit him harder than he let show. He shifted, fingers curling around the rim of his cup. "I never thought I'd want anyone here again," he admitted. "The quiet was easier. Clean." "Clean's not the same as kind," she said gently. He met her eyes, and there it was again, that sense of being read, not judged. Understood. The next day, he brought out an old saddle tree he'd carved years ago and started working on it again. Not for any horse he owned. Not for anyone but her. She watched him shave the wood, patient as the sunrise. "You ever made one for a Mustang before?" she asked. "First time for everything." "You sure he'll take it?" "Sure enough to try." They shared a smile, small and sure. Then came the day when the Mustang spooked. It was a morning touched by gold. The kind of light that made everything feel softer than it was. Colt had gone into town for supplies, leaving Lily to tend the morning chores. Flint had grown more confident, even bold, testing boundaries, pushing into the barn like he owned it. She let him. Trust had taken root, and she didn't believe in punishing growth. But that morning, something shattered, a clay jug falling from the loft, knocked loose by a barn cat, and Flint bolted. Out the open gate, hooves pounding across the pasture like thunder. Lily chased without thinking, heart slamming against her ribs. She didn't call out. She didn't scream. She just ran. Colt returned to find her gone. The dog whined at the porch. The barn gate hung open, swinging like a broken jaw. His stomach dropped. The land, once still, now hummed with absence. He rode hard toward the hills, eyes scanning for dust, hoofprints, anything. And then, near the southern hollow, he saw them. Lily was standing still, hands loose at her sides, Flint pawing the earth a few paces away. Neither moved. The wind pressed her skirt against her legs, pulled her hair loose, and still she didn't break the moment. Colt dismounted, staying back. The horse's nostrils flared, ears twitching, but his eyes were on her. Lily slowly extended her hand. Not demanding. Just offering. Minutes passed. Then Flint stepped forward and touched his muzzle to her palm. Colt released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She didn't turn when she spoke. He didn't bolt from fear. He ran because he could. "He came back because of you," Colt said quietly. She finally faced him. Her cheeks were flushed, hair tangled, eyes bright with something like victory. "I needed to know," she said, "that I wasn't just training him. That he chose to trust me." Colt stepped closer. "And did he?" "Yes." There was a silence between them then, rich, almost holy. She broke it first. "There's a piece of land," she said, "south of here. Mine. It was my grandfather's. Folks back east laughed when I kept it, said it was worthless dirt. But I came here to see for myself." He blinked, absorbing the shift. "You own land. More than a little. You didn't say. You didn't ask." He chuckled once, but the sound was tight. "All this time I thought that I needed saving." Her tone wasn't cruel, only curious. "I thought you had nowhere to go." "I have somewhere," she said. "But I needed to know if I could stay somewhere that wasn't just earned, but wanted." The wind moved through the trees like a blessing. "You want to go?" he asked, quietly. She looked out toward the hills, then back at him. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I'm not running." And he understood then. She hadn't come to find help. She'd come to see if there was a place where she could be fully herself, strong, silent, sovereign, and still be seen as worthy. They walked back to the ranch side by side, Flint trailing behind. No words passed between them, but something had shifted. The fence lines looked straighter. The grass seemed taller. Something had taken root. And it wasn't going anywhere. The light changed after that. Not in the sky. It still rose gold and went to bed in bruised violets, but in the space between them. Colt noticed it first in the way she paused when he handed her coffee. In the way she looked at him a moment longer before speaking. There was no longer anything hidden in her presence. She walked like a woman unburdened, not by forgetting, but by finally choosing what to carry. Lily had begun clearing the small field west of the barn. She did it without asking, moving rocks, stacking brush, breaking earth with an old hoe she sharpened herself. Flint grazed nearby, tethered loosely, content to watch. She said she wanted to plant something. Not for food, not for show, just to see if the ground remembered how to bloom. Colt didn't ask why. He brought her a shovel one morning and joined her in silence, digging through the stubborn clay side by side. That night, she spread a map across the table. Worn edges, ink faded from years folded away. "This is it," she said, pressing her finger to a green patch south of the buttes. 300 acres. Untouched. Untamed. He leaned over her shoulder, eyes scanning the lines. "You inherited this?" "My grandfather's," she nodded. "He won it in a card game and kept it because he liked the way the light hit the hills come sundown. Everyone else thought it was useless. But not you." She shook her head. "I don't think land's ever useless. Not if you love it right." There was quiet in the room then. Not heavy. Just thick with things neither of them had said. "You ever think of building there?" he asked. "I've thought of everything," she said. "Building. Selling. Giving it away just to be rid of the weight." He looked at her then, not just her face, but the years behind it, the bruised hopes, the hard lessons. "What stopped you?" She didn't answer right away. Ran her fingers over the edge of the map. "I think," she said slowly, "I needed to prove to myself that I could be seen. Not for the land. Not for the story. Just for me." He nodded. "And I'm starting to believe I can." There was no reply needed after that. He folded the map gently, handed it back, and she held it like something sacred. The days warmed. The air smelled of cottonwood sap and turned earth. The Mustang's coat shed into summer sleekness. They worked the land together, not as owners or partners, but as people who had stopped naming the space between them. Sometimes she cooked. Sometimes he did. Most nights, they sat on the porch until the stars blinked awake, saying little but hearing everything. Still, something in Colt stirred restless. One morning, while Lily was riding Flint along the southern ridge, he found her satchel near the barn. The flap had come loose. He meant to tuck it closed, a simple courtesy, but a folded sheaf of paper spilled free, a copy of the deed, crisp and legal, stamped and signed. It caught the breeze and fluttered like a leaf across the porch. He stooped to retrieve it, eyes catching the sum total of her inheritance, her name etched in bold. Lily Vale, legal owner of more land than most men dared dream of. He stood for a long time, staring at that paper. It wasn't the land that shook him. It was the realization that he had never once asked what she had given up to come here. Never asked what it cost to be underestimated, again and again, by men like him. Men who saw her strength and mistook it for need. When she returned, wind-blown and flushed from the ride, he was quiet. She dismounted, untacking Flint with practiced ease, and looked at him from beneath the brim of her hat. "What is it?" she asked, not unkindly. He hesitated, then held up the deed. "This came loose." She didn't flinch. Just took it back with steady hands and tucked it away. "I figured you knew," she said. "I didn't. You never asked." Silence pressed in. Not bitter, not cold, but full. "Why'd you come here, Lily? Really?" She leaned against the post, arms folded, eyes turned toward the hills. "I came because I was tired of being small in a room full of men with smaller hearts. Back east, a woman's worth is measured in what she gives away, her beauty, her obedience, her silence. I was told I should sell my land, marry quick, and stop pretending I knew anything about running a ranch. And here," she looked at him, gaze unwavering. "Here, I wanted to see if I could make something grow. Not just on the land. In me." Colt nodded slowly, shame curling in his chest. "I treated you like a guest. Maybe even like a burden, once or twice. I'm sorry for that." She smiled, soft and full of something he hadn't earned but was grateful to receive. "You didn't know better. But you learned." He reached up, thumb grazing the back of his neck. "Do you want to stay?" "I don't know," she said, voice honest. "I didn't come to stay. I came to remember who I am. But now." He waited. "Now it feels like I'm part of something. even if it's just the dust on your boots or the smoke from your fire. They stood there, two people who had built their walls high and their lives quiet, looking at each other without masks. That night, a storm rolled in. Not thunder and flash, but one of those slow, creeping tempests that steals into the bones and makes the air thick. Lily moved Flint to shelter. Colt double-checked the barn doors. And then, without discussion, they both found themselves in the kitchen, watching the sky bruise with cloud. He poured her coffee. She sipped it standing. "I'm not afraid of hard weather," she said. "I know. But sometimes I get tired of fighting it alone." He looked at her, something aching behind his eyes. "You're not alone." The rain started soft, barely more than a whisper. She set down her cup. "If I stayed," she asked, "would it be as a guest or something else?" The room held its breath. "Not a guest," he said finally. "Then what?" He didn't have the word. Not yet. But he stepped forward, hands in his pockets, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "Whatever you want to be. Whatever you already are." Her breath caught, not from shock but from recognition. Then, without fuss or fire, she leaned in, her forehead brushing his chest, and he rested his chin on her hair. They stood like that as the rain fell harder. Outside, the wind bent the cottonwoods. Inside, something stood taller than it had in years. By morning, the storm had passed, and the fields drank deep from the sky's offering. Lily went to the garden. Colt followed her, watching her plant the first seed. Not food. Not flowers. Just a seed she'd carried with her since her mother's death. A red hollyhock, tough and tender, with petals the color of old love letters. She pressed it into the soil like a promise. "Won't bloom until next year," she said. "That's all right," he replied. "Some things are worth waiting for." She looked at him then, not hopeful, not hesitant, but steady. He saw it in her face. She hadn't come to find a place to settle. She had come to see if she could carry the land inside her, and still find room for someone else. And now, she had. The sun broke through the last of the storm clouds. They stood in the garden, earth still wet, hands empty but not alone. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk wheeled overhead. And beneath them, unseen but certain, the roots took hold. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of quiet that holds sorrow. It was the full-bellied hush of things settling into their shape. The garden took to life, rose still small and stubborn, but green with the certainty of growth. Flint no longer needed the tether. He followed Lily like he'd been born beside her, his eyes softer now, full of understanding instead of fear. Colt repaired the south fence, not because it was falling, but because mending things felt more like preparing than grieving. He caught himself smiling more. Not loud, not often, but enough to remind his body it still knew how. Lily stayed. Not because he asked, and not because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because the land had accepted her, its rhythm, its language, its silences, and because, in Colt, she had found a man who saw her not as a marvel, not as a mystery, but as a whole person, weathered and wondrous all the same. But peace, like spring, is always borrowed. The storm came without the usual warning. No smell of wet sage on the breeze. No far-off roll of thunder. Just a sudden shift in the air that turned the morning hot and still as held breath. Colt noticed it first, the way the chickens went silent, the way the dog refused to leave the porch. The sky above the buttes turned a color he hadn't seen in years, greenish, like bruised copper. A storm bred on heat and fury, the kind that rips trees out by the roots and scatters herds across counties. By midday, the clouds had thickened into a black wall. Lily stood in the garden, staring at the sky like she could read its intent. Her braid had loosened in the wind, and her hands were still dirty from planting. "That's not a rainstorm," she said. "No," Colt replied, gripping his gloves tighter. "That's something meaner." They worked fast. The animals were driven into shelter. The tools stowed. Windows secured. The barn doors bolted. Flint was restless. He kicked at the stall and whinnied low, unease trembling through his frame. "He needs space," Lily said, already climbing into the pen. "He won't do well boxed in." He'll do worse if he gets caught in it, Colt warned, eyes flicking to the horizon, where lightning spidered across the edge of the world. But she was already at Flint's side, running her hands along his neck, speaking to him in that low voice that sounded more like music than command. Colt knew better than to try pulling her away. 10 minutes, he said. Then we ride it out in the cellar. She nodded, not turning. The wind came next, sharp and spinning, ripping up dust and pelting gravel against the barn roof. The dog barked once, then went quiet. Lily moved fast, unlatching the pen and leading Flint outside, toward the open pasture beyond the barn where the ground dipped just enough to give shelter. Colt cursed under his breath and ran after them. Lightning split the sky in a jagged scream. Thunder answered, full-throated and close. Lily kept her grip on the lead rope, even as Flint danced sideways, hooves sliding in the churned mud. "We need to get him down into the gully," she called, voice nearly lost in the wind. Colt took the rope from her hand. "I'll lead him. You take the east side and flush him forward if he freezes." She nodded again, no fear in her face, just the kind of focus that belongs to people who've been through worse and survived. They moved as one. Colt guiding, Lily pressing in from the flank. Flint fought at first, wild with storm tension, but gave way as Lily murmured to him between claps of thunder. The rain broke over them a moment later, thick as spilled ink, drowning sound and sight in waves. By the time they reached the gully, the wind had turned savage. Trees leaned hard against the sky, and the earth felt alive underfoot. Colt tied Flint between two rocks and turned to Lily. "We stay here," he shouted. "Nothing's safer up top." She nodded and crouched beside him, both of them soaked to the skin, mud streaked up their arms. Flint stood between them, head low, muscles twitching. Then came the sound neither of them wanted to hear, a tearing roar followed by a crash so close it lifted the ground. One of the cottonwoods near the barn had gone down. Colt's heart dropped. "The roof won't hold," he said. "Let it fall," Lily replied. "We've got each other." He looked at her then, really looked. Her hair was plastered to her forehead, mud clinging to her jaw, eyes shining with stubborn life. And it hit him harder than any wind, that she wasn't the girl who had walked onto his land with a wild horse and a quiet mouth. She was a woman who'd outlasted storms before, who knew how to carry loss without letting it rot her, who could walk through fire and still offer warmth. He reached for her hand. Not fast, not urgent, just sure. Her fingers met his, and neither let go. The storm passed in hours, but it felt longer. When the sky lightened, they rose together, every joint stiff, every breath a prayer. The barn had held. Barely. The roof sagged, a corner torn free, but the horses inside were safe. The porch had collapsed, and the water barrels lay shattered across the yard. But the house still stood. The garden had flattened, but not all was lost. They didn't speak as they walked back up the slope, Flint trailing behind, his sides heaving. The air still smelled of ozone and churned dirt. Smoke from a lightning-scorched tree curled into the sky. Colt turned to her as they stood on the rise, looking out at what remained. "We could have died. But we didn't," Lily said. "No," he agreed, voice rough. "We didn't." They didn't go inside right away. Instead, they sat on the steps where the porch had been, legs caked in mud, water running down their backs. He looked at her hands, still dirty, still strong. And he realized something he hadn't dared say. "I don't want you to leave." She turned to him, brows drawn soft. "I thought you wanted quiet." "I thought so too," he said. "But you're not noise. You're what makes the silence worth sitting in." She looked away, blinking rain from her lashes. Then back again. "I was waiting for you to say that," she whispered. "Not because I needed it, but because it means you finally saw me." "I saw you the day you arrived," he said. "But I didn't know how to admit what I saw." "What did you see?" He took her hand again, muddy and worn. "I saw a woman who never asked to be rescued, but who still managed to save me." Her lips parted, a breath caught between words and wonder. "I've spent so long thinking strength meant standing alone," she said. But maybe it means choosing who stands beside you. They didn't kiss. Not yet. That wasn't how they worked. What passed between them wasn't about urgency or heat. It was the kind of love that grows from endurance, from respect, from two souls weathering the world together. That night, they slept near the fire, not because it was cold, but because they didn't want to be apart. He gave her the blanket without speaking. She tucked it around both of them, and in the flickering orange glow, her head on his shoulder, she whispered a truth that had lived in her for too long. You were right. That storm wasn't just weather. It was everything I've been carrying. He didn't need to ask what she meant, because in her voice, he heard the echo of every no, every leaving, every time someone told her she was too much or not enough. And in holding her hand, he knew she wasn't alone in that anymore. Come morning, they walked the land together. They started where the hollyhock seed had been planted. The soil was soaked through, some rows flattened. But the place where she'd knelt was untouched. She crouched again, brushed back the debris, and found the shoot. Still there. Still reaching. She looked up at Colt. It'll bloom next year, she said again. He offered her a smile, quiet and sure. So will we. The Mustang stood nearby, watching. The wind had gentled. The storm had passed. And in the stillness that followed, there was no silence. Only the sound of two lives, finally aligned, beginning again.